Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today what I want to talk about is the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project was a project put together by a New York Times reporter whose last name is Hannah Jones. It's hyphenated, and it was done to kind of commemorate the arrival of the first enslaved African Americans on the shores of North America and what would become the United States of America, which took place in 1619. And it was published as part of the New York Times Magazine. It was an incredibly popular supplement. And in recent days, in the last week or so, I've seen it mentioned several times by the President and his minions like Mike Pompeo and several members of Congress who can count on to carry his message as an example of an attack on American values and on the foundations of America, and as something that promotes and teaches hatred of the United States of America by attempting to cancel the Founding Fathers and all kinds of ridiculous things like that. So obviously, you know by now, or you should know by now, that anything the President says is likely to be untrue. And that he's likely to distort and misstate and give bad information about anything if he thinks it will help him politically. And what he's counting on right now is that the American people are going to get fatigued with the call for racial justice, and they're going to get fatigued with the protesting, which he's going to refer to and attempt to provoke more violent rioting in big cities by sending in his federal police force, that he's hoping that will create electoral momentum for him in the lead up to the election in November. But just because President Trump is mischaracterizing the 1619 Project, and just because he's clearly using it for his own political ends, doesn't mean the 1619 Project is above criticism. And so I wanted to talk about the 1619 Project today, my opinions about it, my opinions of criticism about it, but will undoubtedly, I think, reflect some of my own biases, as have already been reflected in my statements so far. So like I said, the 1619 Project was published by the New York Times Magazine last year to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved African American people arriving on the shores of North America and what would become the United States. They arrived in Virginia, which would have been the Jamestown colony still, in 1619, and they were almost undoubtedly enslaved people. I think there were 20 to 30 of them who were traded with Jamestown colonists for other things, and they became the first enslaved people in the United States of America. And within the next few decades, Virginia would go ahead and enact a series of laws which created the situation of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is more or less hereditary slavery, where you're born into slavery because of your parents. So then, that in and of itself probably sounds benign enough, but there are a number of things that were asserted in the 1619 Project that have proved to be controversial and are the source of both legitimate criticism of the 1619 Project and the illegitimate criticism of the 1619 Project. So the first claim that draws some controversy is the claim that slavery is foundational in the history of the United States of America, that it's a part of the foundation of the United States. If you want to take it to its extreme, it's possible, then you might think of, or some people might think of the United States as being a slaveocracy, a country founded on the principles of slavery to promote and protect an institution of slavery. And that is one of the arguments that is made. And while I think that argument probably goes too far, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Having been a history teacher and having taught the colonial period in the United States of America, I can tell you that there are some ideas in the American mindset that are so incredibly stubbornly ingrained that it's almost impossible to get them out. And a lot of these have to do with the first colonies. So if I were to talk to you, and just in here, just me talking about the creation of the first English colonies in the United States, I'm willing to bet you that some of you automatically thought of Pilgrims, because we have a tendency to think of Pilgrims in the Plymouth colony founded in 1620 and not the Jamestown colony founded in 1607. Notice there's a 13-year gap in time. And if I were to ask you why colonists left England and came to North America to found these colonies, many of you would tell me they were searching for freedom or they were looking for religious freedom, and that's why the 13 colonies were founded. these are really stubborn myths that I don't pretend I'm going to get rid of right now. I didn't pretend I could break through those myths in the minds of my students. But there are a few things you need to be made aware of or reminded of if you knew this once upon a time. The first two English colonies, Jamestown and Plymouth, were founded by joint stock companies. Those were literally kind of like corporations in which people invested their money, and the company hired men, and the company recruited colonists. And the company sent the colonists to the New World to establish colonies in the hopes of making money. England got involved in colonizing the New World really late, and they saw that a lot of other nations were generating tremendous wealth through colonization, and they wanted to get in on it. And this is how they did it, because the English government did not want to pay for it themselves. These kind of companies came to existence. One of those companies was called the Virginia Company of London, and the other company was called the Virginia Company of Plymouth. The Virginia Company of London established the Jamestown colony in 1607, and it established that colony to make money. The people who came to Jamestown in 1607 were coming for land and economic opportunity. Their motivation was not religious freedom, and the proof of that is that Virginia, the colony of Virginia's official religion was the Church of England throughout its history, throughout its colonial history, that there was no attempt by those people to break free of English religious tradition. So in 1607, colonists arrived, and new groups of colonists arrived, over the next decade or so. In part, they needed lots of new colonists because the death toll among colonists was really high, the mortality rate was really high. And then in 1619, there was a large enough population of the Jamestown colony for them to have a self-government, and the Virginia House of Burgesses was created in 1619. That is the oldest democratic body in what is today the United States of America. That's the same year that the first enslaved people came to Virginia. So slavery has as long a history in the United States as representative democracy does. So for those of you thinking, well, yes, but in 1620 the Pilgrims came and established the Plymouth colony, and they were seeking religious freedom. Again, remember, the Virginia Company of Plymouth was a business. It recruited colonists to go to the New World, and they just called the whole New World that they were thinking of colonizing Virginia, and they were trying to make money. And less than 50 of the 102 colonists who came to Plymouth on board the Mayflower, less than 50, I've seen a number as low as 37, less than 50 of them were actually Puritans seeking religious freedom. More than half were just like the Jamestown colonists, going and seeking economic opportunity. So this idea that we establish colonies for religious freedom really doesn't come true until 1630, when a large group of Puritan colonists led by, I believe, John Winthrop come to the New World, and they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was based on Puritan religious principles. Interestingly, they didn't believe in freedom of religion. If you lived in that colony, you had to follow Puritan rules and Puritan religious ideas. But, that's really when we first got started, and they were more interested in creating a Puritan utopia than a place in which religious freedom was actually took place. So again, notice that slavery has as long a history in the United States as representative democracy, and a longer history in the United States than the principles of religious freedom do. And therefore, if you want to say that slavery is foundational in the United States of America, I think a real good argument could be made for that. Another thing I think a lot of Americans do is they forget how much time passed between Jamestown and the beginning of the American Revolution, but we are talking about 168 years that passed between 1607 and 1775, the beginning of the American Revolution. That's 5 generations of Americans. If we take a generation every 30 years or so, that's 5 generations of Americans. And the truth is, by the time we fought the American Revolution, the people fighting the revolution and leading the revolution were Americans in the sense that they had been born here. There is a long period of time which takes place in colonial history. And during that period of time, the colonies that were established for religious purposes eventually became colonies whose focus was economics. As a matter of fact, that tension probably is one of the things that contributed to an economic classism. It's probably one of the things that contributed to the Salem witch trials in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Anyway, so by the time we get to the American Revolution, really we're looking at 13 colonies that are more or less independently, and they're all being run and they're all focusing on commercial efforts. And a part of that in the South was definitely slavery. The most important crop in the New World, in the American colonies, was tobacco, and tobacco is labor intensive. And as tobacco became the crop, thanks to John Rolfe discovering a strain of tobacco which grew well in Virginia, I think in 1616, tobacco becomes the primary cash crop of the American South, and that means slavery becomes embedded in the economic system of, at the very least, the southern colonies, but slavery also played an important role in the economic system of northern colonies. New York had one of the largest slave trading operations in the New World. So that then brings us up to the American Revolutionary War. One of the charges that is made in the 1619 Project, and this is one which I think is fairly untenable, is that the Revolution was fought to protect the institution of slavery. Well, even the creator, Hannah Jones, even the creator of the 1619 Projects, has admitted that she probably didn't write the sentences in which she described this accurately enough, and that certainly this doesn't apply to all the colonies. It's important to remember the American Revolution broke out in the northern colonies over issues involving, basic rights of Englishmen. And therefore, we can't say that all the colonies were trying to protect the institution of slavery. We also can't say that Southern slaveholders were not motivated by the protecting institution of slavery. I think some of them certainly were, and it didn't help that British officials kept passing proclamations offering to free slaves. That made a lot of Southern slave owners antsy. The third charge in the 1619 Project is probably one of the ones which bothers people the most, and that is the idea that the founders, the founding fathers of the United States of America, didn't really believe in the ideals in which we claim the United States was founded on. So in the United States, we believe that we were founded on the idea of individual rights. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that we create governments to protect those rights. That's essentially, the crux of the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence ideas are then carried into better practice by the Constitution, which is written, a decade or so later. But the idea that the Founding Fathers didn't believe in those ideals, which they set down in the Declaration of Independence, seems to bother lots of people. But clearly they didn't. Jefferson didn't believe that all men were created equal. He didn't believe that people from Africa were created equal with men descended from European countries. He didn't believe that men and women were equal. He didn't believe in racial equality. And before you think, well, they just thought of, enslaved people as animals or property, no, they really didn't. They knew they were human beings because Jefferson and others were, having non-consensual sex. They were raping female slaves and producing children who they recognized as human beings. So they knew slaves were human beings. They just didn't accept their equality. This is the truth. There's no way around it. The Founding Fathers, for the most part, did not believe in racial equality. So they talk about all men being created equal. They meant all white men were created equal. And there's almost no way around that. That is really true. And so in saying the Founding Fathers really didn't believe in the ideas they put down in the Declaration of Independence, that's the point the 1619 Project is making. And that, I think, is where, we get this idea, that and the whole, founded on the institution of slavery. Those two things have led to these charges that the 1619 Project, is teaching hate of the United States of America and is trying to destroy American traditions and foundations. But it's really not, because the fourth point that I want to point out from the 1619 Project is that the author of the lead essay, Miss Hannah Jones, says in her essay that it was African Americans frequently fighting without any assistance and without any allies for those very ideas of equality and equal rights and inalienable rights, that it was African Americans who led the fight for those things, and that for the most part they fought alone. This is controversial and bothers a lot of people. Newt Gingrich famously pointed out that hundreds of thousands of white Union soldiers had died in the effort to liberate and bring slavery to an end. Fair enough, after after January 1st, 1863, when the war more or less became about ending slavery. You could say that, but again, the authors of the 1619 Project are not saying that that African Americans got no help. They're saying they were the ones primarily fighting for it. And if you think about it, who were the first people fighting to end slavery? African Americans. Who were the first people organizing and running the Underground Railroad? African Americans. Whose escape from slavery then created the new fugitive slave law? African Americans, which created more tension between North and South and led to the Civil War, in which African Americans fought alongside white Americans to bring slavery to an end and defeat the South. Importantly, the fifth point that the 1619 Project makes is that we can tie a lot of issues involving race all the way back to slavery and its aftermath. So a lot of people forget that what the 1619 Project is talking about is that a lot of our race problems in the United States today can be tied back to slavery and its aftermath. And the aftermath of slavery is Jim Crow. And I don't think anybody could argue that a lot of our problems with race can be tied back to Jim Crow, and Jim Crow can be tied back to slavery. As I've said several times in my institutionalized racism videos, that there were three phases in which, white Americans essentially attempted to regain control over African Americans. Slavery gave white Americans control over African Americans. When that came to an end, Jim Crow was created. When Jim Crow came to an end, we created this new system we're under, beginning with Nixon and the law and order policies and the war on drugs and all these kinds of other things were created as another way for white America to reassert its control. Now, you don't have to agree with that. I would encourage you to read Carol Anderson's White Rage about how that's worked out in the last, since the 1970s. I think it's a fairly powerful argument that white people afraid of African Americans regaining too much control and having the same level of equality have put in place institutions that take those things away from them. I think that that's, relatively speaking, a fair assessment, but you don't have to agree with that. But then essentially, that's kind of the fifth argument that's made, and that's really made in individual essays written by columnists and some historians, which trace specific, kind of racist policies that we had, race issues that we have in the United States back to all these things. And that's it. That's the controversy. As far as I can tell, those are the primary things upon which the controversy surrounding the 1619 Project is based, or are based. So I want to break critics down into three groups, because two of these groups I think it's perfectly legitimate criticism. You should know all works of history should be analyzed and criticized, and flaws should be pointed out regardless of who writes them or the purpose for which they are written. That is something that should take place. And as a matter of fact, I don't think the authors and the creators of the 1619 Project expected their work to not be criticized. So the first group of critics were actually historians. A small group of fairly well-known historians like Gordon Wood and Stephen Oakes about the American Revolutionary period and colonial period wrote or signed a letter in which they pointed out what they thought were some mistakes and flaws in the 1619 Project. Fair enough. I believe the creators of the 1619 Project had to expect that kind of scrutiny from professional historians, and they got it. And I think a lot of the criticism of those historians is perfectly valid and was well intended, and as a matter of fact, have had the effect that they wanted. Hannah Jones has gone back and said, yes, I probably overstated that, and maybe this is and she's looked at those things, but. One of the things that the 1619 Project has been charged with is that it's revisionist history. I've got news for you. All works of history are revisionist. Everybody who writes a book about history is looking for a new angle, is trying to prove a new thesis. They are all revising history constantly. There's nothing wrong with that idea of revisionist history, as long as it's done within the confines of professional historians and it opens itself up to criticism, and we can then have somebody say something and then somebody say something back and have this conversation about history, because that's what the best history is. It isn't a fixed list of things to memorize and believe. It is a conversation about the past and its meaning for us today. The second group of people are people who I think just had a reaction to the fairly, strident and confident way in which the creators of the 1619 Project put slavery at the center of the American story. I think there is some legitimate criticism to be made here, but here is where I think, we run into, some problems which, we might refer to as white fragility. That some white people just feel like they have to defend the idea that slavery wasn't that important, that slavery was only in the South, that the Founding Fathers, were flawed because they allowed slavery, they really believed in equality and all these kinds of things, and that white people fought alongside African Americans throughout American history to bring slavery and Jim Crow and discrimination to an end, because in some way in some way, on some level, I think some white people don't like the idea that slavery played this big of a role and that racism has had as big an impact on life in the United States as it has had. That's a matter for self-reflection. You can disagree with me about that, but I would just ask you to think to yourself, why do you feel it necessary to defend Thomas Jefferson's belief in, the concepts of equality? Why do you feel it necessary to, say that African Americans didn't fight to end slavery for the most part by themselves, by mentioning the few white people who did, fight alongside? That we have to ask ourselves those questions, and I think the 1619 Project does a great job of forcing us to ask those questions. If we'll listen to what they're saying, we don't have to accept what they're saying, but it forces us to ask those questions of ourselves. And the third group of critics would be kind of finishing up where I started off, with Trump and his minions who want to use their negative description of the 1619 Project. It's a project to teach kids to hate America. It's a project which is a threat to American values and American history. Their attempt to describe the 1619 Project that way, they're doing that for their own political ends, and they are mischaracterizing it, and they are even mischaracterizing a lot of the critics of the 1619 Project for their own political ends. And what they're hoping is to tap into, I think, that kind of notion of white fragility, that Trump believes that by talking about this he can get a lot of white people who are uncomfortable with confronting the reality of slavery and its history in the United States to reject that and to see that kind of discussion as a threat and to support him. And I would hope that we would not fall into that trap and that use of history. Anyway, there you go. There's my discussion video of the 1619 Project. As always, I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and hopefully I'll get a lot. And thank you for watching.